Picture this. It is December 17, 1968. After 23 days and 10,373 miles of mountain passes, desert crossings, a sea voyage, and the brutality of the Australian outback, a single car rolls across the finish line at Warwick Farm Racecourse in Sydney. The crowd is not quite sure how to react, because the car that has just won the most ambitious road rally ever organized over some of the most punishing terrain on Earth is not a Porsche, not a factory Ford, not a Citroën, with all of France's engineering pride behind it. It is a Hillman Hunter. A Hillman Hunter. The sort of car your uncle drove to the office, the sort of car that sat in the driveways of semi-detached houses in Birmingham and Coventry, its beige flanks gleaming with respectability and absolutely nothing else. And yet there it stood, the winner of the first London-Sydney Marathon, a car that had no business being there and every right to be there. So why, in the years that followed, did Britain essentially shrug and forget the whole thing? That is what we are going to talk about today. To understand the Hillman Hunter, you have to understand the world it was born into. Britain, in 1966, was a country caught between ambition and anxiety. The Beatles were at their peak. England had just won the World Cup, and yet, behind the headlines, the British motor industry was in a state of quiet crisis. Roots Group, the Coventry-based company that owned Hillman, Humber, Singer, Sunbeam, and Talbot, was hemorrhaging money. Its ambitious small car, the rear-engined Hillman Imp, had arrived in 1963 with overheating engines and a reputation for unreliability. The losses were serious enough to have invited American money into the boardroom, and everyone in the business knew what that meant. Into this atmosphere, Roots launched the Arrow range, and at its head stood the Hillman Hunter. Section 1. A company running out of road, the Roots crisis. Before we can appreciate the Hunter, we need to spend a moment with the company that built it, because by 1966, the Roots Group was in genuine trouble. The story really turns on the Hillman Imp. Conceived in the mid-1950s as Roots' answer to the BMC Mini, it was a genuinely advanced car rear-engined, all-aluminium overhead camshaft engine, fully independent suspension. On paper, a world-beater. In reality, a disaster. The engine had a chronic tendency to overheat, warping cylinder heads. The new factory at Linwood in Scotland, which the government had insisted upon as a condition of investment grants, was miles from the company's engineering expertise in Coventry. Labor relations were difficult. And then the Mini arrived first in 1959 and soaked up the small car market before the Imp had turned a wheel. The financial damage was severe. Roots posted major losses through the early 1960s. By June 1964, they had little choice but to accept Chrysler Corporation as a financial partner, initially at a 30% stake in their ordinary share capital. Lord William Roots, who had built the company into one of Britain's great automotive dynasties, died in October of that same year. By January 1967, Chrysler had built its holding to roughly 2/3 of Roots' total capital. For all practical purposes, an American corporation now owned one of Britain's proudest automotive names. And yet, the car that would carry the Hillman name to its greatest moment of glory, the Arrow, was designed entirely before Chrysler's influence reached the drawing board. It was a last act of pure British engineering, for better or worse. The Arrow project had been conceived in 1962 as a conventional, sensible replacement for the aging Minx and Super Minx range. With the Imp having burned through the company's risk appetite, Roots opted for something unimpeachably solid. No rear engines, no aluminium exotica, just a proper, forward-thinking, family saloon. Section 2. The car they built, specifications and debut. The Hillman Hunter was officially unveiled at the October 1966 London Motor Show, and it cut a crisp, modern shape in the halls of Earl's Court. The design was led by Rex Fleming, with styling contributions from William Townes, who would later create the radical Aston Martin Lagonda, and Roy Axe, who handled the estate and fastback coupe variants and would later become design director at Chrysler. The saloon's lines were deliberately restrained, upright, angular, honest. It was not trying to be the Ford Cortina's sportier, more glamorous rival. It was competing directly with the Cortina on the basis of solidity, practicality, and value, which is exactly what a significant section of the British public wanted. Under the bonnet sat a new 5-bearing version of Roots' well-proven 1,725 cubic centimeter overhead valve 4-cylinder engine. In standard Hunter trim, it produced 74 brake horsepower and a torque figure of 103 pound-feet, giving the car a top speed of around 90 miles per hour and a 0 to 60 time of 14.6 seconds, as recorded by Autocar magazine in its road test of October 7, 1966. Fuel consumption, the same test recorded, worked out at 26.5 miles per gallon in mixed driving. Those are not numbers that set pulses racing, but then, they were not meant to. This was a car for people who drove children to school and families on holiday. What was genuinely notable about the Hunter was its engineering beneath the skin. For the first time in a Roots car, McPherson strut suspension featured at the front, a significant modern step, paired with a conventional live rear axle on leaf springs. Curved side glass appeared for the first time on a Roots product. Flow-through ventilation was standard. A Borg-Warner automatic gearbox was available as an option, as was a Laycock de Normanville overdrive on 3rd and 4th gears. The engine was inclined at 15 degrees to allow for a lower bonnet line. These were thoughtful details. For those wanting more performance, there was the Hunter GT and eventually the GLS, in which Holbay Engineering, a respected tuning house, extracted 107 brake horsepower from the same 1,725 cubic centimeter engine using twin Weber 40 DCOE carburetors. That was enough to push the top speed to over 100 miles per hour. The Arrow platform proved remarkably flexible. The Hunter was joined by the Singer Vogue and Singer Gazelle for buyers wanting more refinement, and the Humber Scepter at the luxury end, producing 88 brake horsepower in standard form. The Sunbeam Rapier and Alpine fastback coupes styled by Roy Axe sat at the sporting end of the range. It was classic Roots badge engineering. One platform, multiple identities, something for every showroom. Section 3. The Marathon 23 days that changed everything. Now we come to the event that should have defined the Hunter forever. The 1968 London-Sydney Marathon was born over lunch in late 1967. Sir Max Aitken, proprietor of the Daily Express, and two of his editorial executives, Jocelyn Stevens and Tommy Sopwith, were discussing what might be done to lift national spirits. Britain had just endured the devaluation of the pound in November 1967, and there was a general atmosphere of despondency. An international motor event, they decided, that would showcase British engineering and drive through a dozen countries that might just do it. The result was a deal with Sydney's Daily Telegraph, a prize fund of £10,000 for the winner, and a route of 10,373 miles from London to Sydney, across Europe, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India, then by sea from Bombay to Perth, and finally the brutal run across Australia to the finish at Warwick Farm Racecourse. On November 24, 1968, 98 crews left Crystal Palace in London. Among the works teams were Ford with their Cortinas, BMC with Austin 1800s, and Roots with a small but determined squad of Hillman Hunters. Andrew Cowan, a Scottish rally driver of considerable experience but without the glamour of names like Roger Clark or Paddy Hopkirk, was at the wheel of one of those Hunters. By his own account, he had asked the Chrysler Competitions Department simply for a reliable car, one that might finish the event in a respectable position. He was not expecting to win. Nobody was expecting him to win. For most of the event, nobody had to. Roger Clark, in a Works Ford Cortina Lotus, drove brilliantly through Turkey and Afghanistan and took a commanding lead. The Citroën DS of Belgian ace Lucien Bianchi and Jean-Claude Ogier was second. Cowan's Hunter sat patiently in the chasing group, collecting no dramatic stage wins but losing no time to mechanical failure, which, in a 23-day endurance event crossing Afghanistan by night, is an achievement in itself. Through the Lataband Pass in Afghanistan, across the Nullarbor Plain, through the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, where Cowan's Hunter was briefly stuck in sand and had to be towed out by a local character known as Galignite Jack Murray, which tells you something about what these crews were going through. Then Clark's Cortina dropped a valve in South Australia, and what had seemed like a Ford benefit run began to unravel. Clark lost time, and eventually his chances. Approaching the final stages, Bianchi's Citroën led with Cowan's Hunter now in second. Then, barely 98 miles from Sydney, on a transport section near Nowra, a civilian motorist drove the wrong way onto the closed course and hit Bianchi's Citroën head-on. The Citroën was wrecked. Both occupants were hospitalized. Paddy Hopkirk, in his Austin 1800, arrived at the scene first, stopped to help, and was waved back into the event without penalty. Cowan also slowed, received the same assurance that matters were under control, and drove on. Andrew Cowan, who had requested, in his own words, a car simply to complete the event, crossed the finish line at Warwick Farm as the winner of the first London-Sydney Marathon. Of the 98 cars that had started in London, only 56 reached Sydney. The prize money of £10,000 was collected. Cowan, co-drivers Colin Malkin and Brian Coyle, and a battered Hillman Hunter, had done what nobody in their right minds had predicted. Section 4. The silence. After the victory, Britain looks away. Now here is where the story takes its strange turn. When a Ford Cortina wins a major rally, Ford uses the occasion to shift metal. When a Mini wins Monte Carlo, as it did, memorably, multiple times, BMC exploits every inch of that halo effect. When Cowan's Hunter crossed the line in Sydney, Rootes and Chrysler had in their hands one of the great underdog sporting stories of the decade. A modest British family saloon, driven by an unfashionable Scotsman, had beaten works Fords, a works Citroën, a factory Porsche, and the best that 3 continents could throw at it, across more than 10,000 miles of the world's worst roads. And what happened next? Very little. There was no limited edition London-Sydney Hunter. There was no sustained advertising campaign built around the victory. The Hunter remained, in the public imagination, exactly what it had always been: a sensible middle-class saloon, the sort of thing a bank manager might drive. Part of this was down to circumstance. By 1968, Chrysler had full, effective control of what had been the Rootes Group. The Americans were not interested in building a sporting identity around a British product that they were already planning to rationalize out of existence. They had their own priorities, their own platforms, their own idea of what Chrysler Europe should look like. There is also the matter of timing. The Hunter was a genuinely competitive car in 1966. By the early 1970s, the world around it was changing faster than Chrysler, and before them, Rootes had planned for. Front-wheel drive was coming. The hatchback was coming. The Hunter, with its live rear axle and conventional boot, began to look like yesterday's thinking, even though it had been designed as tomorrow's car barely 5 years earlier. Section 5. The Chrysler years and the long decline. By 1970, the Rootes name had been replaced entirely by Chrysler, United Kingdom. The rationalizations accelerated. Singer was dropped in 1970. Humber followed. The Sunbeam Rapier variants were wound down in 1976. By that year, the only Aero platform car still on sale in Britain was the Hillman Hunter, and even the Hillman name was living on borrowed time. From September 1977, the Hunter was no longer sold as a Hillman. It was badged as a Chrysler, a rebrand that many buyers found bewildering. The Chrysler name in Britain was not associated with anything that made people particularly glad to own one. And then Chrysler Corporation, battered by the oil crisis and mounting losses across its global operations, sold its entire European business, Rootes, Simca, the whole inheritance, to the French PSA Peugeot Citroën Group in 1978. The last Chrysler Hunter to roll off a British production line did so in 1979. The final vehicle of all assembled from complete knockdown kits at a factory in Porirua, New Zealand, left the line in September of that year and was donated to the Southwood Car Museum. Before being sold to a private collector in 2000, it was a quiet ending for a car that had once crossed a continent. Former Chrysler chairman Lee Iacocca in his autobiography, was blunt about the acquisition of Roots, writing that Chrysler should never have bought it. That sentence, in its dismissiveness, says more about the Hunter's fate than any number of sales figures. Section 6. The Paykan, an immortality Britain never saw coming. And yet the story of the Hunter does not end in 1979, not by a long way. In 1966, the same year the Hunter was unveiled at Earl's Court, the Roots Group had quietly struck a deal with Iran National, the state-backed automotive company of Iran, to supply complete knockdown kits for local assembly. The arrangement was negotiated with Iran National's director, Ahmad Kayami. The car would be assembled in Iran and sold under a local name, Paykan. In Persian, Paykan means arrow, which was, of course, exactly what the British had been calling it all along. The Paykan became, in every sense that matters, Iran's national car. It appeared in 3 body styles: saloon, estate, and eventually a pickup, and served as taxi, police vehicle, family transport, and workhorse for an entire nation. It was ubiquitous in Tehran in the way that black cabs are ubiquitous in London or yellow taxis in New York. Generations of Iranians learned to drive in a Paykan. Generations of Iranian mechanics learned their trade keeping Paykans running. The relationship between the Paykan and the original Hillman Hunter evolved over the decades. As the Chrysler connection ended and Peugeot took over, the drivetrain was eventually updated with a 1,600 cubic centimeter Peugeot engine, and later with multi-point electronic fuel injection. In 1977, designer Roy Axe, the same man who had worked on the original Arrow range, designed a facelifted body for the Paykan, using interior and exterior components from the Chrysler Alpine. But the basic structure, the bones of the thing, remained the Arrow that had been drawn up in Coventry in 1962. Production of the Paykan in Iran finally came to an end in 2005, 39 years after the first Hunter had been assembled at Wrighton-on-Dunsmore. As recently as 2015, production rights had been sold to Sudan, where the Paykan was briefly assembled under its own name. A car conceived to compete with the Ford Cortina in the Britain of Harold Wilson had, in a roundabout way, outlived the Cold War, the fall of the Shah, 3 decades of sanctions, and the better part of the entire history of the compact family saloon. Few British cars can claim anything like it. So, what do we make of the Hillman Hunter, all these years later? Here is what I think. The Hunter was a good car, genuinely, solidly, undramatically good. It was well engineered for its time, reasonably priced, practical, and durable. It asked no more of its owners than they were prepared to give. In a different world, one where Roots had remained independent and confident, the London-Sydney victory in 1968 might have been the foundation stone of a serious motorsport heritage, the kind that Ford built around the Cortina and Escort, the kind that Lancia built around the Fulvia. Instead, an American parent with other priorities absorbed it, diluted it, rebadged it, and eventually let it go. The Chrysler management could not see or did not care that they had, in Andrew Cowan's victory, a story worth telling forever. The car that won the London-Sydney Marathon, a race across the face of the earth, driven by a Scotsman who just wanted to finish. That is a story. That is an identity. They left it on the table. And yet, in the most unexpected corner of the world, the spirit of the thing survived. Every Paykan that navigated the streets of Tehran, every farmer's pickup version rattling across an Iranian plateau, was, in some fundamental sense, a descendant of the design that left Crystal Palace on November 24, 1968. There are still Hillman Hunters out there. They show up at classic car meets with their quiet dignity intact, slightly overlooked beside the Escorts and the Cortinas, the MGBs and the Triumphs. But the people who know the story of Nara and the Lataban Pass and Galignite Jack Murray pulling a Hunter out of the sand, those people look at that car differently. And they should. Now, I would love to hear from you. Did your family own a Hillman Hunter? Perhaps you remember a neighbor's Singer Vogue, or you have your own memories of the Arrow range. Maybe you were following the London-Sydney Marathon in 1968 and remember the moment the result came through. Leave your stories in the comments below. This channel exists because of people who were there, and your memories are as important as anything I can tell you. If you found this video worthwhile, please do click the like button. It helps more people find content like this. And if you are not already subscribed, we would very much welcome you to the channel. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Thank you, genuinely, for watching. Until next time.